lion?" she asked. I answered as demurely as I could, saying, "I've seen it," and then kept my jaw stiff when I glanced up at Sham. He chuckled under his breath and turned to look outside, perhaps surprised by my understatement. "It's impressive," Maria wanted to know. "Just another big cat when it comes down to it," I said, and dipped my eyes to the golden waves swimming in my glass. This time, when he chuckled, Sham's voice was loud. He shook his head, too, and took a drink. "What?" Maria's eyes passed between him and me. "This fellow Canadian," Sham pointed at my chest, a fist around his tumbler, "and that lion are a true pair." And I guess I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Adrian. Now, a couple of points there, I guess. You can tell that the character, I guess the Safari Ranger, is interested in Maria through his thoughts, and there's a lot of description of Maria through his eyes.
Yes.
So that's kind of interesting with the first person point of view there, because we get to learn a lot about this love interest Maria through his eyes and through his thoughts. So that's fantastic. And just one quick question as well. Now, this novel is inspired by your trip to the safari during your travels when you were doing your travel writing recently.
You know, it's fun. It's funny. That really helped in terms of the research for sure. And but I had been doing a lot of research on Africa. One short story that was published and won an award. It got me writing a lot about the continent and the issues there. So this story was actually developed before I went on a safari, but knowing I was going to be going on one. So it's and obviously from going there, it just enriches the amount of detail I can put in there for sure.
Good stuff. All right, so I want to thank you, Adrian, for coming onto the program today. That's probably all the time we have for now. So perhaps we will wish you good luck with finishing up Triumph the Lion, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Okay, sounds good, KP. You be well.
Okay. That was Adrian Brijbassi, author, journalist, writing instructor, and editor of Vacay.ca, a publication focused on Canadian destinations and culture. We'll be right back after these messages.
The classical tradition was really thought of as a huge storehouse or a huge commonplace book, which Renaissance writers not only could borrow from, but should borrow from in composing their own writing.
When you go back to the Romantics themselves, the notion of intellectual property is not a given.
There are now internet-based search functions, software that can tell you if a paper has been bought from certain sources.
In the digital and internet age, plagiarism has become a complex issue. We hear about it everywhere, from college English classes to front-page headlines. I'm Sally Plaxon. On today's What's the Word, we'll learn how the definition of plagiarism has changed over time. Victoria Khan takes us back to the 16th century, when imitation was at the heart of Renaissance education. Alan Liu tells us about the romantic notion of originality in the poetry of William Wordsworth. And David G. Nichols shares some tips on how to avoid plagiarism in your own writing. Join us on this edition of What's the Word? Plagiarism.
I think the most important thing to realize about the Renaissance is that it was basically a culture of imitation. And imitation meant for Renaissance writers imitating the classics, imitating Virgil and Horace and Cicero and Tacitus, and to a lesser extent the Greek writers, because fewer people knew Greek at this time.
Victoria Khan is a professor of English and comparative literature at the University of California at Berkeley. She's the author of several books, including Rhetoric, Prudence and Skepticism in the Renaissance. During the Renaissance, she says, imitation infused every aspect of education.
If you were a young schoolboy, and it was only boys who got this grammar school education, your education was almost entirely what we would nowadays call a literary education. That is to say that you spent hours a day reading Latin, learning Latin grammar, translating from Latin into English or into whatever your vernacular language was, into French or into Italian, doing imitations of the speeches of Cicero, reading proverbs, reading maxims, and composing what in the Renaissance was called a commonplace book, where you would put your various maxims and favorite sayings that you had accumulated in the hopes of using them sometime in the future when you wrote something yourself. What's striking about this ostensibly incredibly repetitive imitative culture is that it produced one of the most amazing periods of literature that Western civilization has ever known. It produced Shakespeare. It produced Milton. In an earlier period, it produced Petrarch. So there's a paradox really at the heart of Renaissance education. On the one hand, it's all about imitation, and on the other hand, it produced these enormously powerful, influential, and great writers of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries.
The subject of imitation is addressed in Aristotle's Poetics.
And one of the things that Aristotle says is that human beings naturally delight in imitation. And they delight in imitation because they learn from imitation. So in the Renaissance, there were really two ideas of imitation: imitation of nature and imitation of prior texts. And these were equally important for Renaissance writers. And if you were a Renaissance writer, you took as your task precisely to imitate Homer or Virgil or their Italian followers. And your goal in imitating them was to outdo them.
These are the writers John Milton is imitating in Paradise Lost.
Virgil's Aeneid begins with an epic invocation to the muse, and the poet says, "Of arms and the man I sing." Paradise Lost begins, "Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe, sing, heavenly muse." And what's striking about that is the Renaissance reader would have recognized the allusion to the epic invocation of Virgil, but where Virgil is talking about one man, Aeneas, Milton is talking about all of mankind. He's talking about all of mankind in the figure of Adam, and where Virgil is talking about simply Roman history, Milton is talking about world history. He's talking about the creation of the world, the fall, and the redemption of mankind. So if you want an example of a poet who is outdoing or overgoing his classical predecessor, Milton is a preeminent example of this, and he did it over and over again in Paradise Lost.
Ideas about plagiarism in the Renaissance were predicated on a different understanding of what we call intellectual property.
The classical tradition was really thought of as a huge storehouse or a huge commonplace book, which Renaissance writers not only could borrow from, but should borrow from in composing their own writing. Where the idea of intellectual property came in was if a contemporary writer was perceived not to have sufficiently transformed the text that he borrowed. So you don't have intellectual property in our terms in a text if you haven't made it your own, if you haven't assimilated it, if you haven't digested it, if you haven't done something distinctively new with it.
There are examples of Renaissance writing that were recognized as outright stealing. John Milton took King Charles I to task for lifting a prayer by Sir Philip Sidney. As Milton put it,
"A prayer stolen word for word from the mouth of a heathen god, and that in no serious book, but the vain amatorious poem of Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia." Now, what's striking about this is Milton was a great admirer of Sidney, but the point that he wants to make is that Charles is so irreligious and so hypocritical that he can't even come up with a prayer on his own. He has to lift it from Sidney's Arcadia. So that's a moment where Milton is basically accusing Charles of plagiarism. And from a Renaissance perspective, what that means is that Charles is unable to transform what he has borrowed and make it his own so that it truly reflects his own emotions, his own spiritual integrity.
Renaissance writers made their living from patronage rather than from sales.
When you published a book, it was the publisher who owned the license to the book. It was not the author who owned the license. The first copyright law in England came in 1710. It was England's Statute of Anne. This was the first time that authors actually had intellectual property in what they had written.
When she teaches, Kahn borrows a lesson from the Dutch Renaissance humanist Erasmus.
Erasmus wrote a manual called De Copia, which was published in the early 16th century, in which he edited and revised and republished several times. De Copia is a manual about how to speak and write copiously. And by copia, Erasmus means, first, speaking appropriately or adequately to the task at hand, but secondly, he also means speaking at length or writing at length. So it's in a way a manual for a teacher or a student to learn how to write eloquently, but it's also a manual that addresses the problem of writer's block. The idea is that new ideas don't spring out of your head full-blown, that originality comes from imitating other writers, and that you can actually generate new ideas through the process of writing. And the example that Erasmus gives in De Copia is quite remarkable. He says, take the phrase, "I'm so happy to receive your letter." Let's think about all the different ways that this phrase could be said. I was delighted to receive your letter. Your letter greatly pleased me when I received it. I was thrilled by the unexpected arrival of your letter. And he actually prints hundreds and hundreds of variations on "I was so happy to receive your letter" in his manual, De Copia, so that the reader would have an idea of the different ways in which you could vary your speech. This has two effects. One is it teaches you, as a thesaurus would, about how to vary your language. But the other, and I think far more important lesson that it teaches, is that writing is itself a productive activity. And the more you write, the more ideas come into your head. And sometimes they come into your head unexpectedly.
Kahn does a similar exercise with her students, using the phrase "night fell."
And I give them an example of how you might transform "night fell" into a copious phrase. So here's a translation lifted from Philip Sidney's Arcadia of "Night Fell." When the Phoebean chariot, after long dilatory progress, had finished his course across the sky and given way to Latona with her sable curtains to o'er-canopy the inferior orb. That's Sidney's way of saying night fell. It's very long, it's very highfalutin, the rhetoric is very elevated, the Phoebean chariot stands in for the sun, Latona is the mother of Apollo, and she's imagined pulling the sable curtains over the sky.
Kahn has her students write 5 or 6 variations on "night fell."
It's the very activity of writing that starts producing new ideas, new metaphors, new riffs on this very simple phrase of "night fell." You should go and read widely. You should see how other people have put together their articles or their papers. You should look at books that you admire and see how the introduction was written, how the conclusion was written, what the structure of the book is, and you should imitate it. And by imitating it, you will learn how to produce better ideas yourself. No Renaissance writer sat at a computer and tried to come up with a great work of literature. They read Homer, they read Virgil, they read Petrarch, they read Dante, and then they imitated. And it was through that activity of imitating that they discovered what they wanted to make their own.
I'm Sally Plaxon, and you're listening to What's the Word, a program made possible through support from the Modern Language Association of America, an organization dedicated to encouraging the study of language and literature.
I think that one of the benefits of going back in time, at least 200 years, if not 300 years, to consider the issue of plagiarism, is that it really makes us face up honestly to what we no longer understand about the notion of originality and of creativity.
Alan New is a professor in the English department at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He's the author of Wordsworth, The Sense of History, and The Laws of Cool, Knowledge, Work, and the Culture of Information.
When you go back to, as it were, the origin of the idea of originality, dated, sometime in the mid-18th century to the early 19th century, you realize that the notion of original genius and of creativity, that is, of an author who has a unique property of mind that can be copyrighted and needs to be protected from plagiarists, pirates, and others, was fraught with contradiction and came out of its own urgent context and moments. Part of what's going on back then, of course, is that we're watching a transition from an older patronage system to an audience-sponsored mass audience phenomenon. And if you look at the literature of the 18th century, as well as the arts of the 18th century, you'll find an enormous amount of inventiveness as the artists attempted to find new ways to sponsor themselves when patronage was no longer a properly working system. An increasing number of authors are looking to a mass audience, but do not yet quite have all the legal and economic tools and channels that they would need to sponsor themselves securely from that audience. So our notion of an original genius, someone whose work needs to be protected from pirates and plagiarists and others, really arises out of that matrix.
During this transition period, the idea of originality was sometimes contradictory. Lou points to William Wordsworth.
One of the Romantic poets who's often cited as being one of the originators, let's say, of the notion of romantic originality, of a notion of the author who's a unique genius and who has a voice that needs to be thought of as sui generis, born out of himself, out of no one else.
Not only did Wordsworth give rise to a notion of creative genius and originality, says Lou, he also built these concepts into his work. Books 1 and 2 of his autobiographical narrative poem, The Prelude, are about the origins of creative sensibility.
In order to account for how he became a poet, he goes back to the earliest that he can remember in his life, his childhood, to try to remember when it was and how it was that he was first inspired to be a poet. What follows are a number of what Wordsworth scholars call spots of time, sort of frozen, suspended vignette moments in time that are shining examples in the poet's memory of his early inspired genius. And when you look at them, what's quite astonishing is that they are a sustained series of acts of theft or of illegitimate appropriation.
In one episode, Wordsworth writes that he took a small boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cave.
It's the equivalent of a teenager taking a joyride in someone's stolen hot rod. He sees a vast, huge mountain sort of peeking up over him. He's scared. He turns the boat around, and at that moment, a visual inspiration comes to him. He says, and I'll just read the end of this episode, "With trembling hands, I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the cavern of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark," that is his boat, "and through the meadows homeward went with grave and serious thoughts. And after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. In my thoughts there was a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion, no familiar shapes of hourly objects, images of trees, of sea or sky, no colors of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men move slowly through my mind by day, and with the trouble of my dreams." He stole his way, he says, back to the cavern from which he had stolen that boat in the first place. That verb stole sort of bringing out the act of misappropriation that sponsored or initiated this whole episode. Here he sees these unearthly sights silently stealing their way toward him, a poetic act of creativity. So when you look at the first book of the Prelude, which is explicitly an autobiography of his early creative sensibility, of how he became an original poet, you realize that one of the theories of creativity being offered here, not in so many words, but between the lines, is that creativity and originality starts with an act of theft. I call this the romantic Napster theory of originality.
Lou points out that he's referring to the original Napster. But the Prelude offered a second theory of creativity. At the end of Book 2, Wordsworth says,
"If in my youth I've been pure in heart, If mingling with the world, I'm content with my own modest pleasures, and have lived with God and nature communing, removed from little enmities and low desires, the gift is yours. And the yours here refers to the mountains and the streams of nature. And then a little later, just before the end of that second book, he says again and repeats, the gift is yours, ye mountains, thine, O nature. That's what I call the romantic open source theory of creativity. The notion that there is an abundant overflowing of gifts, in this case from nature, that is simply given to you. All you need to do is receive them.
This, says Liu, leads to a question. If everything is freely given to you as a poet, why then do you need to steal or appropriate the work of someone else?
It's not surprising then to me that today we are still caught in this double bind, this paradox, this dilemma, where on the one hand, we believe that creativity is something that is original, unique to the self, given to the genius, but also we believe that originality, genius, and so on is something that needs to be taken, sampled, appropriated, let's use it as a verb, napstered from someone else. Both those theories of creativity, I think, are still very much alive today. So when you speak to our youth, some of the youth in my classes, for example, who put together projects in which they sample other people's music and video and so on, they see that as an act of creativity. What do you mean I'm stealing? I'm taking and reassembling, I'm sampling, I'm appropriating, I'm making something. That's one notion of creativity. The other notion of creativity, of course, is that you need not appropriate or take or steal. If you're truly original, it should have been given to you in the first place, something that you were born with.
In today's digital and internet age, says Liu, we have a fixed idea about intellectual property, despite the many gray areas that persist.
We seem to have become frozen in a particular run of thought about the sanctity of intellectual property, about the sanctity of original intellectual work that is out of tune with what society tells students in a different voice, the voice that tells them instead, we value collaboration, we value teamwork, we value sharing, we value open source, we value the entire culture of a collective building from which true creativity comes.
I'm Sally Plaxon, and you're listening to What's the Word? Plagiarism.
So if we can't trust the sources of information in our society, we can't build on that information and make good decisions.
David G. Nichols is Director of Book Publications for the Modern Language Association. He oversees the development of the MLA Handbook for Writers of Research Papers and the MLA Style Manual and Guide to Scholarly Publishing, both of which have sections on plagiarism.
The traditional definition of plagiarism usually accounts for two kinds of wrongs. The first would be intellectual theft, which is taking somebody else's thoughts, words, ideas, expressions, and using them without acknowledging the source. And the other kind of wrong is fraud, saying that that material was yours or is yours. So that combination is the traditional definition of plagiarism. Since the advent of the internet, plagiarism has become a different kind of problem than it was in the past. The internet accelerated students' ability to plagiarize by providing easy access to purchasing papers, by making it possible to cut and paste, and also to reformat files from their friends.
These, says Nichols, would be considered intentional plagiarism.
Buying a paper online, borrowing a paper from a friend and submitting it as your own, deciding to take whole parts of somebody else's work and integrate it into your own writing, taking somebody else's work and improving it. These are all intentional acts of plagiarism.
There's also such a thing as unintentional plagiarism.
Unintentional plagiarism often comes about when one takes poor notes. If you write down a paragraph from an article that you're using as a source, and then you forget to note that this was actually a direct quotation, it can make its way into your paper, and through your negligence, you can commit plagiarism. You may not have wanted to defraud your reader, as it were, or take the words without acknowledgement, but you did it.
A third kind of plagiarism is self-plagiarism, sometimes called recycling.
Self-plagiarism is using your own work without acknowledging it. For a student, self-plagiarism might include turning in a paper that you use in another course. Generally, when you use your own work in a research paper, and this counts for students as well as for scholars, you need to acknowledge that it's been used elsewhere.
So what do you need to know in order to avoid plagiarism?
When you engage a source in your writing, you can use it in a couple of different ways. One would be to quote directly from it, and that means copying word for word what you're using. And then you can also paraphrase. That's where you're reading a source and you've decided, this sounds useful, I'd like to use this. The wording isn't so interesting, but I want to write down the sense or the gist of what somebody is saying.
Identifying your own ideas and direct quotes should be fairly straightforward, says Nichols. Paraphrases and summaries, though, can be a gray area.
When you're repeating or paraphrasing wording from another person's writing, it's important to know how to indicate that the other person is the author. Here's a sentence from an essay by Wendy Martin in the Columbia Literary History of the United States. Some of Dickinson's most powerful poems express her firmly held conviction that life cannot be fully comprehended without an understanding of death. So that's the original source. Here's an example from our handbook of that source plagiarized. Emily Dickinson firmly believed that we cannot fully comprehend life unless we also understand death. So you notice that many of the words are repeated, the general idea or concept is repeated, and there's no reference at all to Wendy Martin, who wrote this sentence in her essay in the book. But it's easy to change this plagiarized sentence into one that's not plagiarized. As Wendy Martin has suggested, Emily Dickinson firmly believed that we cannot fully comprehend life unless we also understand death. And then that sentence ends with a page reference number. And none of that material is enclosed in quotation marks. It's paraphrased. The language is very similar to that which Wendy Martin used, but it clearly acknowledges Wendy Martin.
Nichols considers the ultimate goal of a research paper a point of view.
To develop the skills to really avoid plagiarism in those gray areas, you need to develop a sense of judgment about how the sources that you are using relate to what's known in a field and what the audience is for your work. And all of these skills are part of the critical thinking skills that you need to develop as a writer, beginning in your college education or before, and continuing throughout your professional life.
As in the Renaissance, says Nichols, imitation still plays a role in education.
One of the difficulties that students encounter as they try to avoid plagiarism is that they're also learning certain rhetorical skills. And in developing those skills, they're imitating what they've seen in other works. There are ways of introducing a topic. There are ways of talking about certain kinds of things. There are ways of drawing conclusions. And they involve phrases that are unfamiliar to students frequently. So in imitating certain ways of speaking, writing, and thinking, it's hard to separate out what is your original voice and what it is that is derived from others. I think this is the big gray area. And when students try also to integrate other sources, they often encounter problems. One thing you can do is, as you outline and prepare to write your paper, make a list of all of the writers and perspectives that you've discovered and recorded in your research, and double-check it to make sure that ideas that you've incorporated into your paper are properly attributed. I think it's sometimes difficult for a student, particularly an eager student, to understand that a new perspective gained in research might not yet be your own.
Using sources well, says Nichols, requires critical judgment.
Chronicling what's been done isn't truly an analytical research paper. An analytical research paper also presents a